Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to the Through a Scottish Prism midweek special. Hope yours and yours are well. You had a good weekend. And everything's going fine to you. Can I just say a quick thank you to all those who have contributed to our crowdfunder and reached out to us. Overwhelmed, folks. We'll talk more about that at the weekend. Today, I'm going to concentrate on issues that are in the east of Europe, in Ukraine and in Russia. Because these things, when we're independent, or if not independent, with the UK nuclear deterrent on our beautiful River Clyde, we have to pay attention to what's going on there. And as with everything else, the Western media, the corporate media, are not giving us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So we're trying our best here. Although I have to say, in all my time in campaigning and in politics, I have never seen such bias, dishonest, lying reporting as has been about this. So hopefully we can help a wee bit here and give you some stuff from both sides, which will hopefully be down the middle. And I make my point right here and now. I am anti-war, have been all my life, and I will continue forever. I don't believe in violence or wars, but they're there, and so we need to discuss it. So to help me, we've got him back again from across in the Emerald Isle, Finbar Markey. Delighted to see you again, Finbar. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, and welcome and hello to all of your Scottish viewers, and I'm sure you've got plenty of viewers from outside Scotland too, Roddy.
Yeah, what we do, we're getting further afield all the time. It's quite amazing. I've seen some in some obscure places, but hey, Scots everywhere. And my usual midweek panelist and helper and good guy, our SNP XS MSP weatherman, it's Lloyd Quinan.
Hi, Roddy. Nice to be
here. Hi,
here.
Lloyd. How are you, my friend? I mean, it's been
very well.
2 days since I saw you. Coming 3 days. Great to see you again.
Yeah, my Bannock burn is calming down quickly.
Well, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm here. This is where I should just say it. This will be my last broadcast in this time from Poland. I'm going back to sunny Spain tomorrow. And so, while you're watching this, actually, folks, so I'm recording this on Tuesday because I am going back to sunny Spain tomorrow. I'll be on the plane. Anyway, Finbar, we could start. I mean, as I said at the start of the intro there, the bias in the reporting of everything that's going on has been absolutely off the Richter scale. Nothing more so than this weekend's the military coup, as was reported in the West. It wasn't much of a coup, and we didn't really get the truth of it all, did we?
I'm not sure we'll ever know the full truth of what happened, because this is international politics and there's only a few key people know what happens, and processes are broken up. So right up the chain, quite often, people will not be fully informed, and it's only the people at the top that will know exactly what's happening. Anybody who has a keen interest in what's happening in the NATO-Russia war at the moment, and that's what I prefer to call it because that's what it is in reality, in the NATO-Russia war, they would have woken up on Saturday morning and been in a bit of a shock, no matter what side you're on, or if you're like me, you don't take a side, but you're completely opposed to both war, the violence and the brutality of war, but also the lack of truth that's been, as you have highlighted, that's been dominating the reporting on this war. So we woke up and we were told that Prigozhin, who's the formal head of the Wagner PMC, private military company, who became most famous for their taking of Bakhmut over a number of months, or Artyomovsk, as the Russians are calling it now. He was on the march, we were told through mainly Western media sources, on the march towards Russia, had taken over Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia, which is one of the key cities closest to the battle lines in Russia, and that Russian civil war was about to break out. Right across Western media, there appeared to be jubilation at the notion that this was happening. If you looked at the politicians, Western politicians, pro-war politicians, right across the board, they were delighted with this development and were encouraging it very much. There was nobody concerned for the fact that Russia is the second most powerful nuclear armed state in the world. Prigozhin is an ex-armed robber, convicted and served time. He became a provider, restaurateur provider of food to the Russian army, and became the titular or the formal head of the Wagner PMC. Over the last 6 months, he appears to, his utterances and public comments and statements seem to have become more and more diluted, and yet he was allowed to stay in the position that he was in. Anyway, they were cheering on this guy, and I noted a distinct change in how Wagner PMC were being described in the media. They went from being vicious, rapist, genocidal maniacs to being freedom fighters and rebels within a few minutes within Western media, because they had the notion that he was marching on Moscow. He put out statements himself he was marching on Moscow. I started to analyze this as soon as I woke up on Saturday morning, and I look for real, proper confirmation of things, not what emotionally I expect or would want to see happen, but what's actually happening. And although we were being told that Prigozhin was marching to Moscow, the majority of his troops, I could find no footage, no images of miles and miles long military convoys marching towards Moscow. And at some point that would have come out, even on Ukrainian sources, who'd have people there waiting to take the photographs, waiting for stuff that are living Ukrainian undercover agents, you might call it. Nothing like that was coming out. We were being told that 10, 15, 20 Russian aircraft were shot down. We were being told that there was engagements between the Russian army and Wagner PMC forces. Turns out most of it turned out to be rubbish. What we can establish, and I will only take this as an admission because it came from Vladimir Putin's own mouth in the last 24 hours, we can establish that one plane was shot down. Now, I do recall on Sunday, Prigozhin made a statement to the effect that one of his men stupidly shot at one of the planes, and he shouldn't have done it. So even Prigozhin was making an excuse. But this notion that there was a major engagement or that there was a massive march to Moscow, it was sorted out within about 15 hours. The entire outcome seemed to play into the hands of the Russian government. On the one hand, if there was an expectation that elements within Russia, whether these elements are organizations financed by Western backers, which Russia has kicked most of them out anyway at this stage, if they were going to come out in the streets of Moscow, the streets of St. Petersburg, the streets of Rostov-on-Don, if the general population that we are told is oppressed, we're told hates Putin, if they were going to come out and support, nothing happened. The military, the former Soviet states, Putin's allies, and internally, they all stood behind what was described right across Russian telegram and social media as our commander-in-chief. So we have to ask ourselves, on the one hand, was this a serious attempt by Prigozhin to march on Moscow to take out the Minister for Defense, which he claims is incapable of carrying out his job? Now remember, Prigozhin put out a video on Friday in which he claimed that the Russian forces, army, had attacked Wagner PMC in the back, as in further behind the lines, and that his evidence was an image of a few burnt tents. He said there was loads of dead bodies. There was no bodies in his images. It looked like a cheap, tacky attempt at a fake video. And this is what he put out on Friday. He's making significant negative claims against the Russian government as well. And the idea that he's been allowed to do this for 6 months without some kind of a comeback suggests to me that there's something. If you might recall, just before the fall of Bakhmut a couple of months ago, a month and a half ago, Prigozhin claimed, put out a public statement saying we have no ammunition left. Yeah. And at that stage, Ukraine threw some more forces into Bakhmut. And then Bakhmut fell within a couple of days. They threw in extra forces because they had been on a missile limit. So, Ukrainian forces are limited to the amount of missiles they're allowed to use every day. That limit was lifted after Prigozhin's statement. And so they started to use their last bit of reserves of artillery that they had in the area, and then Wagner took them. So that was a pretty clear psyop or a bluff. So people were wondering, is this a bigger bluff? And it's hard to tell because on the one hand, Wagner PMC no longer exist. Over the last few months, the Russian Military of Defense, MOD, have been trying to subsume Wagner into the Russian army, and there has been resistance to that within Wagner, particularly from Prigozhin. The outcome of Saturday, Wagner PMC no longer exist. Those who want to have been subsumed into the Russian army. The rest have been disbanded. Prigozhin has been moved to Belarus. Wagner PMC, in terms of the remnants of it, have now also been moved to Belarus within 100 to 200 kilometers of Kiev. Think about that. Well, Akhmat forces are also being moved to that area, and there seems to be a general build-up there. That's another pro on Putin's government side. So they've got three pros. That it showed that the country was united behind the cause, behind the military, and behind Putin. It got rid of Wagner PMC, and it allowed forces to be moved to within 100 to 150 kilometers of Kiev on the northern border. There's a lot of pros in that. As well as that, there's a few people stayed quiet within the Russian government when this happened on Saturday. I'm sure a note was made of that. And their loyalty to the cause and to the government and to the military will be under question because of that. So there's so many benefits to what happened there. And one more final benefit. Within an hour of Prigozhin putting out his statement in Rostov-on-Don, within an hour of that, the Ukrainians announced their sincere counteroffensive, suggesting that they were going to really go into counteroffensive right now this minute, and they did. And what they did was they revealed where all of their armament sources are, where their columns were, where all of their long and short and medium range missiles are, were revealed because they started to put them all into action right along the front line. And so they identified themselves, and they were pulverized over the following 24 hours. So a lot of this, now, it could be the case that Putin's government were aware this was happening, but allowed it to happen on the basis they realized this would be a way to deal with Prigozhin and the Wagner problem. So there is that option as well. Some people are saying, and some analysts are suggesting, Prigozhin was working with Western sources. It's hard to tell. Prigozhin holds two passports, a Russian passport and an Israeli passport. That in itself, just knowing the way international politics works, that in itself would be a little bit of a worry to me in terms of Mossad playing both sides and pretending to be friends with both sides. So that's my analysis of what happened. Since then, on the battles lines, the battles still continue. The Ukrainians in the last 24 hours have taken the Antonov Bridge just entering Kherson. They have about 50 troops literally under the bridge holding that area. They have taken another village that's on a height along the front, just along the front lines, but they still have not, after nearly 4 weeks and massive losses, between 15 to 20,000 men lost, they still have not managed to reach the first line of defense, Russian defense. And there's 5 significant lines of Russian defense on the way down to Crimea. They haven't even managed to get to the first one with massive losses. On the point of the way we discuss this, it's not a football match, and I don't want people to think that I'm talking about this like it's an exciting football match. It's not. Yesterday I saw a video of a personnel vehicle within the battle zone, and there's a camera on the side of it, so you can see the grass and you can see the side where the door is of this, what I think was a Bradley, and the door opened, and one sprightly young fella, Ukrainian soldier, came out of the door, looked around, and I'm sure he wanted to impress his mates in there, in the Bradley, and he jumped out onto the grass, and as soon as he landed, the unfortunate fella landed on a mine, exploded. He was so quick of mind that he immediately went into his rucksack, pulled out a black tourniquet and put it on was able to secure the injury. The lads behind him closed the door on him. But then they opened the door again. Not one came out to help him. He had to drag himself. All that was left of his leg was hanging in the trousers. But it was a stump. The leg was gone. I've seen so many videos like this. This is not romantic. It's not a triumph in any way. It's not a heroic cause. This war has to come to a stop. There's been lots of opportunity. There's been deals negotiated, and Western nefarious influence has always stopped those deals at the last minute. This has to stop, because when Ukraine runs out of personnel, and eventually they will, we're talking about between 350, last time we spoke, Roddy, it was about 3 to 320,000 Ukrainian dead soldiers. And some say that's conservative. We're looking at 350 to 400,000 dead.
Yeah, and the same wounded.
Talking about years of war.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that video, and I should just say to our viewers, and YouTube is very sanitized, folks. Telegram isn't. And as Finbar said, this is not, it's just horrific. I watched that video and I was physically sick nearly. The guy's leg dangle off, and when he does get back into the Bradley, there's the big streak of blood as he gets in. It's absolutely horrific, Lloyd. On on Prigozhin, even if he moved, it's my understanding, Lloyd, that the Wagner consists of about 25,000 warriors. And in many ways, the Russians view them the way the French do the French Foreign Legion. They're heroes to the Russians, especially with what they've done in Bakhmut. But the Russian army's got 3.2 million. And they were loyal, they remain loyal to Putin. So even if they had all marched, but I believe the figures we've been told was like a column of 4,000 got outside Rostov and Don. 4,000 wasn't going to stop 3.2 million, was it?
My feeling about all of this, Roddy, is, I mean, I can't properly analyse it, but what I perceive is there's a Western media attempt to cover up the fact that this war is not going the way they expected it to go. I think the confusion over PMC, over Wagner PMC and the Russians, but as Finbar said, what's actually happened during this period of time on the battlefield has all been success for the Russian side. It's not been success for the Ukrainians in any way. I'm confused entirely by the fact that he has allowed himself to be taken to Belarus. Now, there is no country more loyal to Putin and Russia than Belarus. If he felt himself to be under threat, I think he would have chosen to use his Israeli passport and go to Israel rather than be in Belarus. And I think maybe what's really coming out of this is a great sleight of hand that's going to lead to a new assault on the Ukraine heading towards Kiev from Belarus. That would appear to me to be the situation.
Because last week, Finbar, when the African delegation who went to try and seek peace, they went first to Kiev and then they went to Moscow, and Vladimir Putin brought out the agreement, the peace treaty that had been negotiated last March, the same one that Boris Johnson went over and scuppered. But part of that deal was that Russia would pull away from Kiev, which they did in good faith. They pulled out and back away from Kiev. Of course, the Western media turned that into a retreat, a rout. The brave, fighters of Ukraine had chased the Russians out, but they were again acting in good faith, the Russians. So what Lloyd says could have some weight that, as you said, it's only a couple of 100 kilometres from the border to Kiev. Maybe there is another offensive going to come from there once they've exhausted themselves in this counter-offensive that's not really a counter-offensive.
I think it's important to remember, for those that were cheering what Prigozhin did, Prigozhin's alleged issue with the Russian MOD is the fact that they're not going hard enough on Ukraine.
Yeah,
they were cheering on somebody to come to power that would actually go gung-ho against Ukraine, which Putin has been criticized for not doing. Okay, I do recall that the reports that still linger about the Battle of Kiev, which was actually the Russians facilitating and fulfilling their part of an agreement. We'll never know exactly what happened, and that's how I began the answer to your initial question. We'll never know what happened. We can only look at the pros and cons and who comes out on top through a particular action, and to use our own rationale and our own logic. As an example, the Ukrainians and the Americans have been shouting, saying that the Russians are planning to blow up the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, even though members of the Atomic Energy Agency were there only last week examining the plant again. They're saying that it's been mined now for quite a while, which is all complete rubbish. But the lady doth protest too much, methinks. Whenever they do something like this, and if they did the same in Syria, they would shout about chemical weapons attacks. When I say they, I mean this nefarious secret service that actually controls our foreign policy on behalf of major companies. They did this in Syria. Whenever they shouted chemical weapons attacks, a threat of it, one would happen, or at least an alleged one would happen. And then we'd have a situation where the inspectors would come in. They'd say there was no attack in the reports, and then their seniors would doctor those reports. So there is a danger that the Ukrainians, in a state of desperation, are going to do something like they did to the dam. They're going to do it to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. And that's something that I think we should keep our eyes closely on. again, it's this intrigue that we have to use our own rationale and logic to work through all of these wires in this machine of propaganda and intrigue. And again, as you were saying, Lloyd, it looks like a sleight of hand on the Ukrainian part in terms of the nuclear power plant, as was the dam, as was the Nord Streams, and this might be a sleight of hand on. Putin is known on international political circles as the master chess player. That's how he's known. And people say he's got power through being a tyrant. He's retained power through putting the Russian people first at all times since he first got elected, and stopping the oligarchs from stripping Russia's industry and selling it off to the West for near to nothing, which is what they were doing. And he managed to suppress the oligarchs as a young politician without the years of experience. He's managed to be able to, even with all this anti-Russian sentiment, get 3/4 of the world behind him. 3/4 of the world not giving into these sanctions. And for the first time in the history of Asia or Africa, like we talk about post-colonialism, it never really happened. The companies remained in Africa, dominate. We are now seeing post-colonialism in Africa because of the NATO-Russia war.
Yeah.
And so he's the master chess player because he uses honesty and he holds a mirror up to the West and shows us for what we are around the world, and we can't take it. He doesn't need to create lies. He just has to hold that mirror up.
Yeah, because I mean, Lloyd, I mean, as the Western media have told us, Putin is dying of cancer. His people hate him. He's stupid. They blew up their own pipe. They blew up their own dam. They're going to blow up their own nuclear power station with all their own soldiers there. And the Russian army are ill-equipped. But as you pointed out, the Ukrainians have not gained an inch of ground, except which was ceded to them by the Russians. And I was reading today that apparently at the rate they're going in this counter-offensive, it would be 16 years before they took back the Donbass, never mind Crimea. The lies, have you ever seen such propaganda and lies in your life as we've seen about this Ukraine war?
No, but it's because I worked in the media for so long, it's an area of particular interest. I also grew up with the Vietnam War and the Cyprus engagement on our tea time news every day for years. Now, getting back to something that Finbar said, you know, the Russians have been restrained. You know, I'm old enough, and I'm sure we all are, to remember the war in Chechnya. Now, the war in Chechnya was the Russians doing what they do best, which is absolute obliteration of the enemy, which is the standard tactic of the Russian army. The fact that they didn't do that in the first invasion made me think, wait a minute, what exactly is going on here? And I realized this was Putin effectively telling the world, we can, if we want to, kill loads of people, but what we're doing is we're avoiding that. Now, no, he's been given no credit for that whatsoever, because had the Russian army, along with Wagner PMC, taken the same and carried the same tactics as they did during the Chechen war, then this would have been over a long time ago, but millions of people would have been killed. And I think we have to counter to some degree the disrespect that's shown to the Russian people and to their leaders on the basis of Western prejudice. We seem to have seamlessly moved from the evil Soviet Union to an evil Russia. And to me, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. A NATO at the moment, which seems to be seeking out enemies rather than doing what it was set up to do, which was to maintain peace. And in the end, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about people being killed, a country being brought to its knees for, as far as I can see, the arrogance of the individual that runs Ukraine at the moment, probably by remote control. But the tragedy of all of this is the massive amount of death and destruction that's happening. When there's opportunities, the South African delegation offered, others have offered as well, to make a peace. And peace is the only thing that's going to fix this particular situation. But unfortunately, we in the West are being propagandized to believe that the only true and proper outcome of this is the absolute defeat of Russia. That's not possible.
No, no, it's not. The other thing I heard, Lloyd, was, of course, and I think it's a fair comment, the other reason, or two reasons. One, well, the way the Americans do it, shock and all, go in and flatten everything and then send in the infantry, and if anything moves, civilian military just kill it. And when the Russians didn't do that, they thought, well, there's something wasn't right. But the way Putin looked at it is, these are brother Slavs, and he doesn't want to kill brother Slavs. He didn't go looking for this war. It was sort of kind of forced upon him as NATO moved closer. And he has tried to avoid civilian casualties. He will never get the credit he deserves for that, will he?
No, he won't. But I think, in some ways, this war has covered up the internal tensions and the internal civil war between right and left within the Ukrainian community. This is an issue that's been bubbling up for a long period of time, and there is real division amongst the Ukrainians who remember the end of the Second World War, who remember it was the Soviet army that released them from the bondage of the Nazis. But unfortunately, there are also a certain section of the Ukrainian population who have a misty-eyed view of the Nazi time, who have a concept that Ukraine was free under the Nazis, and that they should honour those Ukrainians who, in their hundreds of thousands, joined the Nazi army and took part in incredible atrocities. And I think the tensions that there have been within the Ukrainian community itself, because of one part of that society wanting to lionize these war criminals in reality from the Second World War, and the other side who are disgusted by that. And to some degree, Russia's involvement is about, as they did in the Donbass, is about protecting those people who have that view of history against those who have a rose-tinted view of history under the Nazis.
Yeah, the Banderas. And Bandera is now a revered man in this Ukraine. But that's something, Finbar, if we were to turn around and accuse Israelis of being Nazis, we would be in so much trouble. However, people are, I've had seen it today on my Twitter feed, people accusing the Russians of being Nazis. Now, of all the combatants in the Second World War, it was the Russians and the Soviets who lost more people than 27 million people. To call them Nazis is the absolute disgraceful and so wrong.
One of the key defenses against the idea that there are Nazi formations in Ukraine is the constant reply you get, but Zelensky's Jewish, but Zelensky's Jewish. So what? He's a puppet. And, they'll put up these formalities to get around things. As an example, during World War II, during the rise of the Nazis, the Nazis worked with Jewish groups to achieve their means. It was rabbis who collected up all the children to bring them out, to send them to the concentration camps and eventually the gas chambers. I saw an interview with the former head of Mossad who roundly condemned Zelensky for his associations in Ukraine and who he was associating with, and called him a traitor to the Jewish people. But we shouldn't be too bogged down with this notion of, I'm a Catholic, I don't go to mass, right? But I was born a Catholic, raised a Catholic, right? Maybe Zelensky's one of those Jews. He's not particularly Jewish in behavior, but he just happens to be born a Jew. You know what I mean? Religion's not what it used to be in terms of people's practice of it. So that sometimes is the reply that you get, and it just doesn't wash, because Western media were reporting for 10 years about the Nazi problem in Ukraine, and you can still find those reports online using Google. So we don't have to, go through a presentation here of all of the evidence about the associations with Nazism. You don't have to do that. You just go into Google and type in Nazi groups Ukraine. It still comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one article I saw this week, it was on Le Monde, Lloyd, and it's quickly disappeared. I couldn't find it. And it was a French ex-general who said that about 40% of the troops trained by NATO are already dead. 40%. So if 40% are dead, it would be fair to say the same again. I mean, I'm not an expert on war, but the same again are probably wounded. They're going to run out of men.
It's usually 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, Roddy. I mean, particularly these days when battlefield weapons, particularly the story Finbar said about the guy jumping out of the back of the Bradley, the types of mines that are used now are to disable. They're not about killing people. They're about disabling vehicles, disabling individuals, so that clogs up your medical support. It clogs up the effectively the strategy of attack. And what we're seeing here is an awful lot of pictures of people who have limbs missing. And that's as a result of these weapons, which are not designed to kill, they are designed to maim. So we always have twice as many or 3 times as many wounded as there are killed in any war situation now. The worst of this is when you see on social media the pictures of the squads snatching people off the streets in the Ukraine to take them to the war. Now, we don't have absolute detail of that. Maybe these are guys who have ignored their call-up papers and are being snatched, as happened to people in this country during the Second World War. Or is it that they are so lacking in manpower that they are having to drag people off the streets? I mean, I saw one a couple of weeks ago of a group of policemen turning up at a football match and lifting people and taking them away. But ultimately, this is about the tragedy of these men have wives, they have children, they have mothers, they have fathers. This has to stop because, as we all know, this is a proxy war. This is not a war wanted by the people of the Ukraine. This is a war wanted by their leaders, and it's a proxy war for the American and NATO military-industrial complex. And that is important to us as Scots and important to the Irish as well, because we sit on the edge of NATO. Currently, us as Scots, as part of the United Kingdom, are part of NATO. And it's a question for us in the future, and hopefully not the too distant future, about whether or not we wish to take the same path as the United Kingdom, or whether we want to take a different, and I would suggest a better path, which is the path of the Irish Republic.
Yeah, I noticed that they've actually raised the conscription age in Ukraine up to 60 years of age. And you got 60 years of age, I was having trouble putting on my trousers no more, let alone going into battle with a gun. I mean, it's really bad.
16 to 60, Roddy, was the age that was
16
raised.
to 60, kids and old men. It shows you how bad it's got. Finbar, President Orbán of Hungary, he said that Ukraine no longer exists as a sovereign nation. Everything is decided war, peace, and mobilization in Washington. Is Orbán being a scaremonger? Do you think that's fair?
I think it's fair, but just before we come to that, I just want to highlight a video I saw a couple of days ago that came out of Telegram. And just in terms of those conscription teams and what options these guys have, I shared a video on M-Compass Media a few weeks ago of a young man who was willing to throw himself off a high-rise building rather than be conscripted. And the conscription team eventually got him while he was trying to throw himself and arrested him. A video came out a couple of days ago from the Ukrainian side, and it looks, there's a number of men in a foxhole or in a trench, you know, the little chambers they've dug out in the trenches themselves. And there is a senior officer demanding to know why they didn't continue pushing forward in the offensive. And they said they did, but all the rest of their men were killed and they couldn't move forward. The general then demanded from one of his assistants or subordinates behind him a grenade. Took the grenade, took the pin out, threw it in and killed those men, his own men, because they didn't move forward as he wished them. This is the behavior of what Nazis did in their final hours in World War II. So what is the option for these people? I saw a young man wallop a conscription team guy across the head with a number of rocks when they tried to get him the other day. And although that might have looked a bit OTT, he was being sent to sure death. Coming back to Orbán, and whether Ukraine exists as a sovereign state. Does it exist as a geographical entity? Could it exist? It could exist as a geographically defined entity. In terms of who controls it, it can't be independent fully now. Or at least right now, this minute, is controlled by the United States. There's no doubt about that. But into the future, will Moscow have to have an uneven hand in Kiev from now on to stop this happening again? I don't know how they envisage the future of the Kiev western side of Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is gone. It didn't want to. Its initial votes were not about joining Russia. They initially voted, and the Minsk agreement was based on their autonomy within Ukraine. That's what they agreed to. And then, we think it's just because of the NATO expansion. The specific reason why Putin went in February 2022 is that, and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, whose job it was to monitor and to count the missile and armament strikes exchanged between both sides up to that point, noted a massive increase in the bombardment on the part of Ukrainians. And these are the right-wing sectors like Azov onto Donbass. And it was clear they were about to go in, and there was going to be a massacre, and many civilians were going to die. That's what the final straw that made Putin and his government decide that week and those few days to go in. The plans were already made, but that's why they went in. That specific reason. That's gone now. Those areas now are formally a part of Russia. And there's nothing that I can envisage is going to change that, even if they do what the Americans want, to persist with war for years to try to suck Russia's energy, which is what they've committed to. They're saying they're never going to give up the commitment. What did the German Baerbock say, the German foreign minister say? That she doesn't care what the German people think. They're going to continue supporting Ukraine. So they want this to go on for years. So will Ukraine ever be the Ukraine it was? Never again. It's gone. The western part of Ukraine could be independent, could be sovereign, but there will always have to be some kind of a pact and agreement which will include oversight from both the West and Russia. That will have to be some kind of an end game here.
Yeah. As I said, I'm here in Poland, and there's talk of Poland getting back ancient lands of Poland in the West, and the Romanians are looking to grab a bit, and the Hungarians are looking to grab a bit. There's going to be nothing of Ukraine left. Lloyd, part of that article in the Washington Post, which said it would take them 16 years at this rate of this counteroffensive to get back, they've also said that if it doesn't, if the Ukrainians don't start making some headway soon, that there's a possibility that there could be peace talks by the end of summer. God knows how many will die before then. But do you hold any hope that there could be peace talks by the end of the summer? And what have the Ukrainians got to negotiate with or about?
I think I hope there's peace talks, but I want, whenever armed conflict of any form breaks out, ultimately that the only way it will come to an end is either with hundreds and thousands of death, or with peace, and ultimately peace talks are what required. I don't particularly hold out hope at the moment, but I do have a feeling that I think even America has realized it's got itself into a situation which is extremely difficult to extricate itself from. But and also I think they understand that they're dealing with some fairly rogue individuals. I think the danger for us would be if the Ukrainians become so desperate they do carry out an action against the nuclear power station. And I fear, because we are, it's nuclear powers facing nuclear powers. That is my main fear, is that from an accident or from stupidity, we end up either with a nuclear accident or a nuclear exchange of some kind. And what I fear most of all is the fact that over the past 10 to 20 years, the threat and the understanding of the threat of nuclear weapons has diminished in the minds of our population. People no longer have the same sense that they had in the 80s and the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, that nuclear weapons are effectively bringing the world to an end. We've lost that fear amongst the population, and we've lost that understanding amongst, I think, some politicians of just what this confrontation means. And if they are not focused on peace and gaining a peace treaty, then I think all of our politicians are effectively abandoning their responsibilities. But I can't see Zelensky sitting down at a table. Maybe Zelensky's the one who is the problem, and maybe we'll see change when the Americans decide that he is the problem.
Yeah, as Kissinger said, to be an enemy of America is dangerous, but to be their friends fatal. Let's not forget Saddam Hussein used to be best buddies with America when they were fighting Iran, and look what happened to him. I'm a great believer, or worrier rather, Finbar, that and touching on what Lloyd said, that the American administration are ideologues and definitely Russophobes, and not one of them has got military service among them and understand. I don't think they've got a clue about the brutality and what they're facing, and they seem to believe their movies and their own ideology that the Americans just send in a platoon and it will be over. The Russians will retreat and give up. It really is a concern.
I think the people who are running the foreign policy of the United States at the moment live in a 1950s, 60s fantasy, spy book fantasy world, almost James Bond kind of a world. And to be honest with you, that's our culture. When I talk to some people in Ireland, they still have this James Bond mindset about Russia. You know what I mean? And so it's been inculcated into us from when we were children to aspire to this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
you know,
Red's under the bed.
Yeah, if you were to look at how American foreign policy has operated for the last century and almost a half, from World War I onwards, even before it, whenever they engaged in conflicts, they always tried to get other people to engage on their behalf, or at least let the other sides fight out till the end, till they were exhausted, and they'd come in as the cavalry. Did it World War I, did it World War II. They're doing it now. And I don't put it past them to have the expectation that there will be someday American boots on the ground in this conflict. I'm not saying 100% there will be, but if you just look at the pattern over history of how they have operated, and they've openly admitted this is about draining Russia, but to what end? What comes then? Are they waiting for an internal uprising like possibly they tried with Prigozhin on Saturday? That's not happening. It's clear now that Russia stands behind Russia, if you know what I mean. So, and even like what surprised me was even the Communist Party, who is Putin's arch enemy politically in Russia, even they, I know a lot of people in the West perceive Putin and that to be a communist or something. He's quite the opposite. He's economically very extremely liberal, and the communists hate him. But even they came out in support of him as the commander-in-chief, in that role as commander-in-chief at that time of crisis. So whatever expectation they had about an uprising, so it's not going to be internal. So it's going to have to be external. So they're weakening Russia, but to what end? To what end? Because they know that
are they weakening Russia? It seems to me the Russians are getting stronger. They're getting wiser. They're learning things. They're learning about their equipment, their tactics, the weapons of NATO. It seems to me that if the Americans did come in, if they've got any ammunition left, they might take on. This isn't Afghan tribesmen or Iraqi soldiers. This is a battle-hardened, well-trained, well-equipped army.
I put it like this. I believe that Blinken and the rest of them every morning have to look for the duster and to go to the blackboard where all their plans are drawn up and rub out little bits here and rub out little bits here because it's just not working out. But the bottom line is there's hundreds of thousands of people dying. There are millions of people displaced. The destruction, the cruelty of all of it. There's brother against brother. I was up, I like my markets. I was up at a market a few Sundays ago, and there was these lads selling I didn't know they were Ukrainian at the time, selling bits and bobs. And I asked one of them what he thought about the conflict. He was all very pro the Russian side. And his brother hopped out of the car where he must have overheard us and ran out and said, no, Putin, bad man. He should not do this to Ukraine. So brother and brother. or split.
Yeah,
Reminds me
that's
in a way of the Irish Civil War in a way. But in terms of where it's going, the battle lines are very briefly changing and then changing back again. As we say, Antonov Bridge, 50 men took it. It's been celebrated like it's a big victory. It's a start, I suppose, in Kherson for the Ukrainians, but can they maintain it is the question. So they haven't even got, as I said at the beginning, to the first proper defense lines of the Russians. This is going to go on for a while at least. Is Prigozhin right? You know, sometimes if you go to pull a tooth, and you're and it might be quicker in the long run and that was Prigozhin's some of his proclamations and claims that we should go all out and just end this war as quickly as possible by defeating the Ukrainians confidently. So who knows what's going to happen? Did the Russian government decide, like for instance, Shoigu, the Russian Minister for Defense, is still in power? Whether he's going to be slowly resigned off as a part of this deal with Prigozhin, or whether that's just not on the table at all, it's hard to tell. But the fact that this has been discussed in Russia, and I've seen it on Russian Telegram channels where you can translate it easily enough using Google Translate, where there seem to be some people saying, let's push harder against Ukraine, let's finish this war with a fist.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just to say, well, one of the people who are following this, Lloyd, is Colonel Douglas MacGregor, who incidentally I've been trying to get to come on here and give us his wisdom. He was talking about, what deal was done. It was over in 20 hours, this so-called coup, which was never a coup. And one of the things Prigozhin thinks that, his men went in hard and Bakhmut could have been harder if they hadn't been restrained. He thinks, could it be that the deal's been done, that now that Russia will wait, let them, instead of them being worn down, the Ukrainians will wear themselves down in this counteroffensive, and then Russia will go, let's just finish it. And he believes, and I think he's right, that this war will end when Russia decides, not when Washington decides, or Kiev decides, or Brussels decides. When the Russians decide it's over and they've hit all their goals, that's when it will end. And I've got to say, I think that sounds about right.
It looks like that, Roddy, and I would tend to agree with you, but I'm still taken by the fact that to achieve that, hundreds of thousands of people are going to have to die, and for me that's anathema. But another thing I'd just like to say is the influence this war has had in our domestic politics, and I mean the politics of Scotland. The fact that I go past the Scottish Parliament and there's a Ukrainian flag flying outside our national parliament, the fact that our previous First Minister declared that we, the Scots, are on the side of the Ukrainians. We effectively have been declared an ally by our politicians with no consultation whatsoever. Where was the maturity in deciding that we would pick a side when we're not even a state? Where was the political maturity in simply parroting the NATO approach in this conflict? We are a country seeking to be a voice in the world in the near future. We cannot afford to have our politicians in a devolved assembly declaring themselves in favour of one side or another in any conflict. It's completely and utterly wrong. And worse than that, what it does is, I think, it continues this propagandization of our people to convince them that the way forward is for us to remain within the NATO umbrella and for us to be part of the military-industrial complex, when in reality, independence should be about us making the true choices of where we can make a proper contribution to the world. And I would suggest that being a member of NATO is not a great contribution to the world, as we're witnessing from the events currently happening. I think also, as we said earlier on, the idea that our politicians can choose upon our behalf to declare that the country is in support of one side or another in a conflict that we have no direct part in, when what we could have done, the good bit that we've done, which is accept refugees, give them the support during this period, but choose not a side. Please don't choose a side. I mean, it worries me every time I see a Ukrainian flag hanging out the windows of houses, which is quite a lot of houses in Edinburgh, this virtue signalling, which in reality is anti-Russian. And why? Why are we anti-Russian? What exactly has Russia, or does Russia threaten Ireland or Scotland? Why is it our politicians, and it's true, unfortunately, certainly of the Fine Gael politicians in Ireland, they seem to have, when it comes to foreign affairs, a British mentality. And isn't the whole purpose of us being independent, both Ireland and Scotland, so that we can approach with a Scottish mentality and an Irish mentality and bring that cultural influence to bear on the world?
Now, one of the things that got me into the independence family in the first place was because they always opposed every war, wanted ceasefires, no violence, no war. And it's another betrayal I found by Miss Sturgeon when she did that and sent money to help buy arms. I abhor violence, I abhor wars. It really, and what I don't understand your point about people taking sides. This media that everyone in the independence movement and the reunification unit, and I'm sure in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, they've lied to you all your life about everything. Why are they suddenly telling you the truth about this war and about the big bad Russians? They're lying to you again. Waking up, be like us, research, look elsewhere, get information. On the decolonisation thing that you touched on earlier, Finbar, there was another quite a development. I was amazed. The Americans have been sort of falling out a wee bit with Israel because of certain things they're doing that they don't like in Israel. But they're pushing Israel to supply Ukraine with weapons, and Netanyahu's saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And so he's fallen out with America. I see today he's turned up in Beijing, and the Chinese again are trying to rope in Israel to help them with their peace initiatives. The Chinese are playing this pretty well, are they not?
They are. The Chinese, again, are non-reactionary in their politics. How you get to the top in Chinese politics it's a meritocracy, and I don't think we really conceive how Chinese politics works. There is a democracy in it, but it's really based on a meritocracy of how good you are at the roles that you undertake. And so Xi and his government are the best of the best that China can produce in terms of diplomats, in terms of their skills, of being able to come up with concepts and make them happen and make them happen fast. So China is playing a big part in trying to bring peace and at the same time try to look neutral. Here's the overall problem, and it's linked to Scotland as well. 3/4 of the world has not bought the crap that we're being fed in the so-called West about this conflict between NATO and Russia. And they're not buying into the sanctions either. We have cut our economy off 3/4 of the world, away from 3/4 of the world. The EU introduced a law over the last week in which it will be able now to sanction and punish countries that don't go along with the sanctions. And that's going to be the end of the EU when it comes to economic growth. Ireland in the first quarter of 2023 had a GDP drop of 4%. It's normally a panic if you hear 0.25%. They had a GNP drop of 8%, 4.6% for GDP, GNP 8%. And nobody's talking about it. And a lot of that has to do with these sanctions, the increase in costs, and the way we've cut off 3/4 of the world's economy. Quite often the people who have the materials, we've cut them away from us. Scotland, if it's independent, will have a choice to be able to trade with as many partners as possible and not to buy into this kind of sanctions rubbish. So it's not just about militarism, it's about the economy and about being able to get access to what you need at the best affordable prices without politics being involved. And up until this conflict, business and economy was allowed to progress in the world generally without politics overwhelming it. And this is the first time in global modern economics that such an overwhelming thing has happened. And so from China's point of view, there's loads of people playing great games of politics and diplomacy here. Syria has been taken back into the fold in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has veered away from the Americans. I believe that it was almost 6 months, and Biden couldn't get a phone call with any leadership in Saudi Arabia. You know, when it comes to what you were talking about originally, the Israelis, I'm always careful with them. They're a bit like Erdogan. They're master survivors. They literally are, and they'll play every side possible. So I'd just be wary of them. I wouldn't be surprised if they are supplying military aid to Ukraine and they're just not saying it. Like, they won't admit that they have nuclear weapons when we've all known now for 30 years, 40 years that they have nuclear weapons, and they still deny that they have them. You know, so the Ben Gvir in the Israeli government and his extreme anti-Palestinian Zionism, that there is a wee bit of an embarrassment to the United States. And of course, they're going to make some public utterances that they're not happy with it. But what have they done? They've done nothing.
No, never will. No, the Israeli lobby is too strong, far too strong in America. It's a hypocrisy. Some of the hypocrisy, Lloyd, is quite incredible. I mean, every day that our midget prime minister couldn't wait to tell everyone he sent his guaranteed a loan for another $3 billion. He's sending all sorts of more equipment where we're suffering like you can't believe, but we're finding money to fuel us. The Americans are sending $1 billion here, $1 billion there, 10 billion here, 100 billion there. Van der Leyen, she's doing it all the time as well. And then they say, oh, well, the Iranians, oh, how dare you supply the Russians? The hypocrisy and double standards is quite incredible.
It's absolutely extraordinary. But I mean, this gets us to the domestic agenda. You know, there's no money for the nurses. There's no money for the railway workers. There's no money for the people who have to use food banks. But to virtue signal to Washington and to NATO headquarters at Brussels, suddenly Sunak can find money from down the back of the sofa. Now, this cuts right to the centre of what's wrong with politics in the Western world, but most especially in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot spend that amount of money on something that doesn't touch the lives of our people on a day-to-day basis, just willy-nilly, while at the same time saying you can't provide the services, some of them, you know, life-dependent services for the people because there's no money. The real question here is, what priorities do our politicians have? Is it to get the pat on the back from those that are in the same political class as them, is to be seen to, you know, be part of what the political order have decided is the priority for the world? Or do we need politicians who would rather meet the needs of the people and the citizens of their country? Because effectively our people are being denied, our citizens are being denied their services because the money's being spent elsewhere for the sake of the reputation of individual politicians, be it Johnson, Sunak, or indeed Miss Sturgeon herself.
Indeed, it's disgusting. Last question. We're running out of time. Clock always beats us in this show. I noticed as well, Finbar, you're talking about the end of the EU, and a year ago I would never have thought that, but now I was listening to the President Vučić of Serbia, who the EU are bullying them like hell to join in this attack in Russia. And of course, they're fellow Slavs, they're very sympathetic towards Russia. And remember that Russia stood by them while NATO was bombing them into the Middle Ages in Serbia. But he's now talking about giving up his application to get into the EU and joining BRICS instead. And Hungary are saying something similar. They're getting bullied and saying, well, we might just go to BRICS. They are the masters of their own downfall, are they not? And of course, the Americans don't care. They're desperate to see the EU collapse. I just don't understand why people don't wake up and, as they say, smell the coffee.
The Serbian situation, I think if you recall, ultimately, the war in Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia was caused by Serbia's strong relationship with Russia and the fact that it wouldn't give up on the Iron Curtain had come down. Russia was in a state of flux. Yeltsin had got power. He was a drunk. He was allowing so this preluded the rise of Putin himself. Serbia's history they have chosen to suffer to maintain its relationship with Russia in the past. And they're doing that today. Now, I've read some analysis that the current leader of Serbia is really kind of an American stooge. He's a mild version of what could be there in terms of standing up for the sovereignty. So we don't know whether this is just talk or not. But we have Macron looking for an invite to BRICS to observe. Well, I'll tell you, I'd invite him and I'd give him sandwiches that would have him on the toilet for 6 weeks. That's what I do with him. My God, such a cheek, but it's got them worried, hasn't it? It's got them worried.
Yeah, where's General de Gaulle when you need him? He was right to stay out of NATO and say no to the British. He warned that we would be trouble in the EU, and he was right. Gentlemen, the clock's beaten us. I can only thank you so much again, Finbar, Lloyd, for joining me here to help impart something to the people. And I hope out there, folks that are watching this has helped and it's given you some information and indication. You don't believe the media for anything else they tell you. Don't believe them about this. Do your own research. Don't even believe us. Do your own research. Look into it, because I'm telling you, it's the worst I've ever seen in my life. But until we see you at the weekend, all of you and yours, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.